Hi everyone, today I'm going to be talking about adrenal fatigue. So adrenal fatigue is a very commonly referred to condition, both in the alternative medicine world and by clients, by almost, I would say the general public almost. It's gotten that much notoriety. And that's why I wanted to talk about it, because here's the thing, and this is what I'm gonna break in today's talk, is adrenal fatigue even real? And that is brought into question. So what we'll go through today is I'll talk about the stress response system. That's what the adrenal glands largely control. So I'll talk about the stress response system, what the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is. I'll talk about the symptoms of adrenal fatigue, and then I'll also talk about what adrenal fatigue actually is, because that name and the concept is actually misleading as to what's actually happening. So we'll talk about what adrenal fatigue actually is, which is HPA axis dysfunction. We'll talk about the 4 most common causes of HPA axis dysfunction, and then of course, what you can do about it. Okay, so adrenal fatigue. I can't count the number of times I have had clients come in and say, it's gotta be my adrenal glands are shot. And I mean, even in, alternative medicine practitioners, many people come in saying they've been diagnosed with adrenal fatigue, sometimes having spent months or over a year working with a doctor, a natural medicine doctor, on their adrenals to no avail. They're not getting the resolution of symptoms that they would expect. So let's talk about what the adrenal glands are, and then I'll talk about symptoms first of adrenal fatigue. We'll talk about what the adrenal glands are and the HPA axis. Okay. So first, to start off, part of the reason why adrenal fatigue is such a common perception and diagnosis is because the symptoms are ubiquitous in the sense that many people experience these things, and they can be attributed, associated with other conditions. So we're looking at things like fatigue, especially fatigue upon rising, so sleeping through the night and waking up not feeling rested. Insomnia is another one, so not sleeping through the night and then obviously not waking up feeling rested. Headaches throughout the day, more particularly in the morning, but especially throughout the day. Weight gain, blood sugar issues, craving salt, aches and pains, susceptibility to infection, sometimes a discoloration of the skin. So you'll actually see like tanning almost of the skin. These are some of the common, and I'll also say like heart palpitations, arrhythmias, tachycardia. So these are some of the more common symptoms associated with adrenal fatigue. So as you can see, things that many people experience. So now let's talk about what the adrenal glands do, because that'll make more sense when trying to understand and explain what the concept of adrenal fatigue is. So our body has 2 stress response systems. One is the sympatho-adrenal medullary system, and SAS for short, sympatho-adrenal medullary. And what that means is that's the adrenaline response. So that's our short-term stressor. So if we're walking down an alley, somebody scares us in the middle of the night, we startle with adrenaline. That is the SAS system at work. And that actually that's a sympathetic chain. So that goes straight from the brain through the spinal cord and then targets the adrenal glands all via the nervous system. So it's immediate, right? We can appreciate the immediateness of it. That's not what we're gonna be focusing on today. That can be a component of this, but that's not what we're gonna be focusing on. The second stress response system is called the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system, or the HPA axis. This is our intermediate to long-term stress response. So the way that this works is we perceive stress or we experience stress. So I'll explain and define stress in just a minute, because it's not just emotional stress. Stress refers to any change in our internal or external environment that creates an internal change. So I'll elaborate on that. But nonetheless, the experience of stress, the hypothalamus in the brain, one of the master endocrine glands, and the kind of the primitive region of the brain. So we have the hypothalamus that perceives the stress, that triggers a hormonal release to the pituitary. That's the P in HP axis. Hormonal release to the pituitary. The pituitary then releases what's called adrenocorticotropin hormone, or ACTH. That hormone then travels to the adrenal glands via the blood. And in the adrenal cortex, the outer region of the adrenal glands, that then stimulates the release of cortisol, which is our primary longer-term, intermediate, and long-term stress hormone. There's other hormones too. We look at aldosterone, pregnenolone, DHEA. These are all precursors to cortisol. We can look at the sex hormones also, so estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. So there's others that go along with this. But again, when we're talking about the HPA axis and the stress response, I'm going to keep it to cortisol for right now. So intermediate long-term stress response system is called the HPA axis, hypothalamus, pituitary, adrenal. It's also worth mentioning that this same pathway, the same axis, regulates our circadian rhythm. So we all have a day-night cycle, right? Every cell in the body is subject to the circadian rhythm, where we wake up in the morning and then we gradually become tired and go to sleep at night. So every part of our body is programmed to that. And the HPA axis in some ways helps regulate that. So what that means is cortisol levels follow normal cortisol levels, so just, no stress, regular day. Normal cortisol levels follow a very specific rhythm. So they're highest in the morning because cortisol is an energizing hormone. And it's worth mentioning too that cortisol levels actually start rising about an hour or so before we actually wake up in the morning. And then when we open our eyes and see light, any kind of blue light in particular, which includes the sun, it also includes electronic devices. So I'm mentioning that for a reason. But when we wake up in the morning and open our eyes, there's a huge jump in cortisol. We call this the cortisol awakening response, or CAR, cortisol awakening response. 50% of our cortisol is produced from the cortisol awakening response, okay? So wake up in the morning, open our eyes, we get this big burst of cortisol that's energizing, it wakes us up, so we get out of bed, and then slowly throughout the day, especially with changes in light, so that's a big part of what governs the circadian rhythm, changes in light, so throughout the day, cortisol levels slowly drop at the same time until they're at their lowest in the evening at night when we're going to sleep. And melatonin starts to rise, and that's what allows us to sleep. So melatonin is the sleep hormone, has an inverse relationship with cortisol, okay? So that's how the normal HPA axis, circadian rhythm, I should say, that's how the normal circadian rhythm functions. So cortisol follows a specific rhythm. Now, if we experience some kind of stressor, let's say there's work stress, right? We'll just say regular stress, then cortisol levels can increase and respond to that stressor. So if you were to happen to measure someone's cortisol levels in response to, while they're currently experiencing a stressor, it would be higher than what would be the normal range of that circadian rhythm. So now let's talk about stress. I'm going to define stress, then we'll talk about adrenal fatigue, what that concept is, and then we'll go into what's actually happening. So in our world, in the world of integrative medicine, when we say stress, we're not referring to just emotional stress. We're actually referring to 3 different categories of stress. And in this case, I want everyone to keep in mind that all 3 of these can stimulate the adrenal response, and all 3 of these can also be sources of inflammation. Because inflammation, very simply put, is the immune system's response to stress, okay? So when looking at the 3 categories of stress, first category is chemical stress. So some examples of chemical stress would include food sensitivities or poor diet, blood sugar regulation, so like fluctuating blood sugar levels, We've got gut dysbiosis, so an imbalance of the microbes that are in the intestines, nutrient deficiencies, hormone imbalance, toxicity. Those are some examples of chemical stress. Second category is physical stress. So physical stress includes, if you sprain your ankle or break a bone. It could also be more significant forms of physical stress like traumatic brain injury or whiplash or car accidents or surgery or pregnancy and labor. All of those would count as physical stress. And then the third category is, of course, emotional stress. And emotional stress counts as both the day in, day out stressors like traffic and work and juggling a family and a job and, financial stress. It also includes the life-altering stressors like the death of a loved one or losing a job or long-term significant financial stress. So if you think of all of those three categories, if you think of the stress response like a bucket, if you keep dumping water into a bucket, eventually it overflows. And when it overflows, that is when diagnosable conditions and symptoms manifest. So when looking at it from the stress response perspective, I'm going to give you an analogy because we want to talk about resiliency. So resiliency refers to your body's ability to handle stress. So if you look at stress like a bank account, or your health, I'll say your health like a bank account. If you've got a really good solid foundation of, large sum of money in the bank account, and you're consistently making deposits and withdrawals, and that stays within balance, then you're gonna be okay if there comes a time period where you need to make more withdrawals than you normally would, right? Because you've got that solid foundation. On the other hand, if you're consistently making withdrawals but not making deposits, then eventually that bank account is going to suffer, right? And will eventually overdraw. Same kind of concept here. So with stress, there's a really great book called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And the title of the book says it all. It's all about the stress response, how it affects every aspect of our health, every part of our body. So the name says it all. Zebras don't get ulcers because they spend 90% of their day grazing with their friends, right? They're relaxed, they're in a field, they're grazing, and then a lion comes along and they sprint and they run for like maybe 20 minutes, maybe lose one of their friends, and it's extremely stressful for 20 minutes. And then it drops back down and they go back to homeostasis. And that's how the stress response is supposed to work. But in our day and age, in modern society, we're kind of experiencing the inverse of that, where we're hopefully not stressed for 20 minutes, right? Maybe we have some kind of a meditative technique, maybe we exercise, maybe we just handle stress well, but we're hopefully not stressed for at least 20 minutes. But I think a large majority of people can relate to the fact that they're stressed for 80% of their day, right? 90% of their day. And that is not healthy. The body was not designed to live that way. And so we have systems in place that allow us to adapt to that situation, to the experience of chronic stress, but they can become maladaptive. In other words, if we're constantly drawing from our bank, if we're withdrawing from our bank, the solutions that our body comes up with become maladaptive, and that's where we get into problems. So that leads us into what is the concept of adrenal fatigue. I'm going to bust the myth of adrenal fatigue. It's not really a real thing in how it's described. And what I'll replace it with is an understanding of what's actually happening with the adrenal system. So the concept of adrenal fatigue was released back in the 80s, I think like 1984. This researcher was studying cortisol patterns in subjects and found this, what he perceived as a correlation of the stress response. And what that includes is we go into a high period of stress. Basically, there's 4 different categories of adrenal dysfunction. I'm not going to go through all of 4 of those in detail, but basically what it describes is that we go through high periods of stress and we can only sustain that stress for so long. So it's either a really major stressor, like the loss of a loved one, a major infection, something like that, physical injury. It's either a really major stressor or it's just chronic. So, type A personalities, for example, people working 80-hour weeks, things like that. Either way, large amount of stress, long period of time. The concept is that the adrenal glands can't keep up with that demand, and so they eventually fatigue, and what that looks like is low cortisol levels, so consistently low cortisol levels. And if you were to measure cortisol on a saliva test, it would look like it was consistently below the line. That's the concept of adrenal fatigue, is the adrenal glands eventually fatigue, and so they can't keep up with the demand, and so cortisol levels fall, and it leads into a whole other host of issues. Cortisol regulates our immune system, for example. So if we don't have cortisol, then we're more, it increases immunity. It kind of, I would say, regulates. So we're susceptible to more infection. We're susceptible to chronic unregulated inflammation. It could be other hormonal imbalances, blood sugar dysregulation, weight issues. And so that's kind of where, this constellation of symptoms comes from, is from this low cortisol. Now, if you were to ask an endocrinologist about adrenal fatigue, they would say it's not real, it's a myth. And adrenal fatigue is actually, that specific term is actually not used in Western medicine. And kind of appropriately so, because it doesn't describe what's actually happening. What is used across the board in natural and conventional medicine is the term adrenal insufficiency. And which is accurate, and we're gonna take that one step further by saying it's actually HPA axis dysfunction. So let's explain what I mean by that. First, I want to describe one situation where adrenal fatigue is real, and it's one situation, and that is Addisons disease. So Addisons disease is actually autoimmune in nature, which means the immune system is attacking the adrenal glands, and that prevents them. It's like the equivalent to type 1 diabetes, where the immune system attacks the pancreas, and that prevents the adrenal glands from being able to release cortisol, obviously. So just like I would say insulin is not the solution for type 2 diabetes, but it is for type 1, same concept here. They're really 2 different etiologies. Again, it's not a problem with the immune system. It's not a problem with the adrenal glands in Addison's disease. It's a problem with the immune system. Now, that is a diagnosable condition that's recognized by all forms of medicine. That is a condition in and of itself. It's rare, but it's a condition. Second is what we call, and that's primary adrenal insufficiency. Secondary adrenal insufficiency is more common, and that's where we're going to spend our focus. So with secondary adrenal insufficiency, we have to look at the entire HPA axis. So hypothalamus to the pituitary to the adrenal glands release of cortisol, and the fourth part of that, which is the body's utilization of cortisol. So let's talk about what that actually looks like. So as I mentioned, the body's not designed to be exposed to cortisol for very long periods of time. And just like most other things, when the body becomes dysfunctional, it has adaptive mechanisms in place to protect it kind of from itself. So when we're exposed to high levels of stress consistently, we have to look at what we're measuring in salivary hormone tests with cortisol. So in salivary hormone tests, we're measuring free cortisol. Almost all hormones have this capability where we have a free version and we have a total version. The free version represents unbound levels of the hormone that are capable of doing work in the cell and eliciting changes. The total levels represent the amount of the hormone that's bound to a protein. Proteins allow that hormone to circulate in the blood they're basically carrier proteins, so they deliver it, right, to wherever the target destination is. So in a salivary cortisol test, we're measuring free levels of the hormone. That actually only represents about 3 to 5% of total cortisol levels. Now, it's a good thing to measure, but here's one thing that's worth mentioning is one of our adaptation mechanisms, if we're exposed to chronic stress, is to bind up more cortisol. So it's not that we aren't producing cortisol. The adrenal glands can keep up with the demand. We can produce cortisol. It's being bound up. And it's bound up by the liver. These binding proteins are produced by the liver. It's bound up by proteins that are produced by the liver. And again, it's a protective mechanism. So that's first is, now I share this because it can look like low cortisol on the test. And legitimately, it might be low free cortisol. So you may be experiencing the symptoms of adrenal fatigue, of low cortisol. But I bring this up because the adrenal glands aren't fatigued. They're producing cortisol. We just have a protective mechanism where we're binding it up. That's first. Second is that cortisol can actually be converted into cortisone, which is a weaker form of cortisol. So if we have a higher conversion rate of cortisol into cortisone, again, kind of as a protective mechanism, it'll look like low cortisol on the salivary hormone test. Third protective mechanism is cortisol resistance. So this can happen with almost any hormone, thyroid hormone, insulin. Many people are familiar with insulin resistance, where if you have chronically elevated levels of the hormones, one way that the body protects itself is by down-regulating the amount of receptors on cells for that hormone. So now it doesn't have as many places to bind, which means it has less capacity to elicit its effects. And that can lead into HPA axis dysfunction. But more importantly, when that happens, if we create cortisol resistance, again, what might show up on a salivary test as low cortisol could actually be high cortisol, and the cortisol is not getting through into the cell and therefore coming out in the saliva. So all of these are, like I said, protective mechanisms so that the body isn't exposed to cortisol for prolonged periods of time. Now, what can happen, and this is where, I said that I was going to reframe what adrenal fatigue actually is. What can happen is HPA axis dysfunction. And what happens with HPA axis dysfunction is it can be from all of those things that I just described. So elevated cortisol binding levels, conversion of cortisol into cortisone. It could be from, the result of the cortisol resistance. But what happens is our brain, that HPA axis I talked about, the pituitary doesn't signal the adrenal glands at the right time and in the right amount that it should. So that is what we want to talk about. In this case, again, I want to reiterate, the adrenal glands are fine. They can keep up with the demand. There's no evidence that there's this pool of adrenal function, and if they become depleted, we can't produce cortisol. There's no scientific evidence of that. But there is evidence of this dysregulation happening in the brain. So, what are the 4 most common causes of HPA axis dysfunction? Number 1, perceived stress. Perceived being obviously the operative word, because we all can appreciate that 2 people can be in the exact same situation. One person finds it stressful, the other person doesn't. And this is where, we go back to the brain. We look at the amygdala. We look at that, the limbic system, the stress response system. I really want to drive home a point here. And I talk a lot about this, about the subconscious mind and stress management and all of the, how we perceive stressors. And the big thing here, and this is why meditation is so valuable, just like you can learn how to ride a bike by repetition, you can reprogram your stress response through repetition. So this is why in all of my wellness plans, when I'm working with people long-term, I have these plans that include ample amounts of support. And one device that I use is a form of neurofeedback. It's called the Muse headband. And the Muse headband, basically what neurofeedback is, it's a form of biofeedback. Biofeedback works by choosing different biometric markers. It could be heart rate, it could be breath rate, it could be even like skin conductance, so sweat amount on the skin. Choose a biometric marker and tune in consciously with that marker so that you can learn how to control it. So how the Muse headband works is it's this headband that measures your it's an EEG, electroencephalogram. It measures your brainwave activity. And it uses sound to help guide you into a calm, relaxed alpha theta brainwave state. That and heart rate variability training, those are the two most researched forms of biofeedback in a way that allows for direct feedback for you to lower your stress response. So it physiologically helps you retrain your stress response. And the HRV, the HeartMath Institute, does a lot of research on this. And it's scientifically shown that through HRV training, you can actually lower your resting stress response. So something that used to be perceived as stressful no longer elicits that same hormonal cascade. So perceived stress is one reason of HPA axis dysfunction. And this is why stress management, things like meditation, like breath work, HRV training, Muse training is so critical to helping adrenals. You can't supplement your way out of this. You have to reprogram how you viscerally and intrinsically respond to different stressors. So I'll use myself as an example. I have always been notoriously really poor at handling stress. I got overwhelmed very quickly. Traffic set me off every time. I was always feeling like I was in a rush. I just didn't handle stress very well. And it was really affecting my health, my sleep quality, my mood, my digestion. And so this year, actually, I set the intention that I'm not allowing that to happen anymore. And let's be realistic, 5 days a week, I practice with that Muse, and I've practiced breath work, and I practice visualization, and my intention is to lower that response. And it has transformed my life. I pretty much at the end of every day, I would end up just like stressed and anxious. And now there's not that issue. There's really not that issue. And so I cannot stress enough the importance of stress management through measurable means. Breath work, again, using a form of device, whether it be HRV training or the Muse training, some form of neuro or biofeedback. To really tap into how you perceive stress, right? Because we've all heard stress isn't the problem. External events have no meaning unless we apply meaning to them. It's all about how we perceive it. So, factor number one, perceived stress. Regulate stress response. Use some kind of a reproducible method to do that. Second, inflammation. Anything that causes inflammation. So I mentioned earlier in this talk, I gave the 3 categories of stress. And I said these 3 categories of stress are also the exact same things that cause inflammation. Inflammation gets a really bad rap. It's touted as being the root of all chronic illness. And that's right to a degree, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that whatever's causing the inflammation is the root of chronic conditions. So inflammation is just the immune system's response to injury. That's it. It's the immune response to injury. And the 3 different categories of injury are what I talked about: chemical, physical, and emotional. We need inflammation it's how we heal ourselves. We need the inflammatory cascade. But like stress, inflammation only becomes a problem when our ability to heal it, when the level of inflammation supersedes our ability to resolve it. So when we look at inflammation and we talk about decreasing inflammation, you can't just pop some turmeric, right? You got to identify what the sources of that inflammation are for you specifically. So is that gut dysbiosis? Is it infection? Is it perceived stress? Is it relationship stress? Is it food sensitivities, right? So blood sugar dysregulation being a big one, and that's actually going to lead me into my third point. But nonetheless, anything that causes inflammation affects the stress response cascade. Identify the trigger of the inflammation, work on that, lower it, adrenals, cortisol, it begins to heal on its own. Third principle is blood sugar dysregulation. So that deserves a whole category in and of itself. So the short of it is, because blood sugar is a whole topic in and of itself, blood sugar, glucose in other words, is our body's easiest form of fuel. Because of that, we want it to stay within a narrow range throughout the day, which ensures that all of our cells have the fuel they need to conduct all of their metabolic demands. Low blood sugar, when it drops too low, is a stressor, and that immediately triggers the release of cortisol, because cortisol helps break down tissue to raise blood sugar. High blood sugar is also a problem, because that also is a stressor because it's inflammatory. Glucose left in the blood for too long is like a Chinese throwing star. It damages blood vessels, it damages nerves, it glycates proteins, which means it makes them sticky and dysfunctional. So again, that creates injury, that releases cortisol, kind of perpetuates the problem. So blood sugar dysregulation is a big one. And balancing blood sugar through diet, I love intermittent fasting, anti-inflammatory, low glycemic, kind of paleo style diet, for example. That will be a really big principle of regulating the adrenals. That's number 3. Last one, number 4 is circadian rhythm dysfunction. So, for example, it's really important. I mentioned that we get a 50% rise in cortisol when we just open our eyes in the morning and see light. Light is a very powerful trigger for cortisol and circadian rhythm regulation. We can use this to our advantage, and there's also ways that it can hurt us. How we can use this to our advantage is when you first wake up in the morning, expose yourself to light. Open up all the windows, go outside, go for a walk is even better. Expose yourself to light. Expose yourself to light throughout the day. Natural light is better. Yes, synthetic light still releases UVB rays. I'm sorry, that's not what I meant to say. Natural light still releases blue light, which is what actually triggers that response. But sun has, right, UVA, UVB rays. We can synthesize vitamin D. It helps our mood. Sunlight does a lot more than just blue light. So get outside first thing in the morning. Go for a walk throughout the day. And in addition, our pineal gland, which regulates melatonin levels, also responds to sunlight. And so another great opportunity for this is go outside in the evening. Go for a walk in the evening when that light is starting to naturally drop. And that will also start triggering the brain. Oh, it's getting dark. Less cortisol, more melatonin, right, to prepare you for sleep. I always notice this and appreciate this when I go camping, because there is no artificial light. Our phones don't even work. We can't be on our phones. We have no artificial light. And so we go to sleep at like 8:30 sometimes because we're exhausted and the sun's going down. Sometimes it's been dark for an hour, and so we're tired. And so we can, really appreciate that change just by looking at camping and what would happen if there was no artificial light. And that brings me to point 2 with this topic, is how light can actually hurt us. And that is through the use of artificial light in the evening. So if we're looking at our phones, if we've got a bunch of lights on, if we're watching TV, if we're on the computer, especially, I've been guilty of this. You're laying in bed scrolling. That blue light is telling your brain it's daytime. So keep cortisol high, lower melatonin. And it can lead to insomnia, poor sleep quality, poor deep sleep, poor REM sleep, and contribute to that circadian rhythm dysfunction, right? Especially when you look at people that are doing this consistently. So if you're on the computer 9, 10 o'clock at night, if you're working, now we've got emotional stress, we've got the chemical stress with the light, then all of those things will disrupt circadian rhythm. So the best option, you know, if I could say turn off all electronics an hour before bed, great. I'm not even sure I would do that. So the best follow-up to that would be to at least wear blue light blocking glasses. Blue light blocking glasses they block that blue light, right? And it's the blue light that really, like I said, triggers the release of cortisol, etc. So wear blue light blocking glasses as soon as the sun starts to go down. Put away work and anything that's emotionally stimulating. That I can say. Put away anything that's emotionally stimulating, that's tied to some kind of an electronic device. Set that aside, especially as soon as it starts getting dark. Read instead, use dimmer lights, use red lights, and then, like I said, wear the blue light blocking glasses and go for a walk in the evening when the sun is starting to set. And all of those things will help with resetting the HPA axis. So that kind of summarizes the talk. And the last thing I'll say, you know, of course, is what you can do about it. And this is where, you know, so many people come in, they say it's my adrenal glands that are the reason I don't feel well. And I'm like, maybe, but we got to look at what's happening beneath that surface. Because if you go in and try to support the adrenal glands, maybe you take some adaptogenic herbs, for example, like ashwagandha or rhodiola or ginseng, or maybe desiccated adrenal glandulars, you know, all of these things have a purpose and they have a place. I use them all the time. But if you just give that and you don't work on the blood sugar and the inflammation and the food and the diet and the gut and all of these other factors, it's kind of like trying to put out a fire by pouring water on it while somebody else is pouring gasoline. It's not really going to work, right? So what you want to do is use those natural compounds, use adaptogenic herbs, use adrenal glandular in some cases, while identifying those underlying stressors and then working on the aspects that we can directly control. Mind-body work, meditative work, breath work for the perceived stress response, light exposure in the morning, throughout the day, and at night, blood sugar regulation, intermittent fasting, maybe eating smaller meals throughout the day. All of these things will help, and then obviously identifying the sources of the inflammation. All right. So I hope that was helpful. That was a really long talk, but again, I'm glad, because I feel like that's a really, like I said, common complaint, and it's often very poorly understood. So wanted to share all about the concept of adrenal fatigue. You know, to recap, we went through what the symptoms of adrenal fatigue are. I busted the myth of adrenal fatigue, sharing it's not really a real thing. It's not that the adrenal glands can't keep up with the demand and they fatigue. It's that there's hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis dysfunction and body protective mechanisms that affect bioavailable cortisol, and that leads into the symptoms of low cortisol. Then we talked about the 4 major drivers behind HPA axis dysfunction, and of course, what you can do about it. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.